All right, I'm going to see if I can cover all the new stuff in the 3.0 version of the auto terrain cover. I changed the name mainly because there's no such word as texture. I had to find something because it just bothered me. Let's see. Make sure you have the plugin enabled inside of your content viewing. So if we go down to the main plugin, if I can find the folder, inside of here, you'll have your textures. You have the sky, which is just a stand-in auto sky. If I select it, you can see you can change the time of day, all that good crap. There's a moon crap, all that good stuff. Anyway, to the material itself, everything in here is based around the instance material, since more than likely you won't have to change the actual material. I mean, the base material itself. You have to change everything and even add your textures to the instance. And here I have a default instance which has all the customized settings that I've picked for this to look the way it looks. Each layer, there's about 9 layers now. Each layer has pretty much the same settings. You have it used to be a near and far texture, but that's too costly. I left the code in there in case you want to enable it, but right now I just have the one texture. You can change the size, the tint of it to be able to change and modify the colors however you want in case you need to tweak something. You have that normal intensity and normal scale of that normal. And if you need be, you can change the metal and rough of the actual texture itself. By default, it's set to 0 and 1, so just plain settings in general. Each of these layers are stacked on top of each other based on your mask. I'll go into the materials in a few minutes, but everything is pretty much stacked on the top of each other. Certain things like the grass, I have a overall masking, and what that will do is the mask that's used for the grass can actually be offset for a little bit. I don't know if you can tell it here. Maybe if I can disable it. If you disable it, this little outline that you actually see, I'm using that to give a little bit of kind of like depth look to when you actually have the trail. That's why I have it a little bit nullified, almost down to where you can't see it, even though the little cloud shadow is blocking it. But I faded it out so at least trails, when you actually paint them, has a little depth to it for the fall off going into the grass and makes the edges seem a little darker. To me, it looked like it stood out more. You can go into the material and remove it if you don't like it, or play around with the settings however you want. As for, thank you, autosave. I appreciate that. All this stuff is just the standard, all the layers. The riverbed is the newest layer. I'll show that in a second. All right, one thing I've added is, I think I've had this before, but I've changed it and modified it. You can have a global normal to your terrain based on wherever you bring your terrain from. If you have a global normal that you need to multiply against the terrain, you can have that. You can have a color map overlay to actually add a little bit of macro color. You can't see it here in the terrain itself, but like if you look over here in the mountains that use a similar material, it kind of has the stuff that I've baked from World Machine layered over top of it to help smooth out the visual. Instead of having a near and far parameter for each of the materials, you can use the actual macro color to give an overall color and shade to your terrain. And depending on what you're doing, it may and may not work for you. You can control the beach fall off as before. None of the bugs exist that exist before. Grass type fall off. Pretty much what this is now is for each of these grass types that covers the terrain, you actually have the ability to limit it by height. So say that you have this applied to the entire terrain. If you had it applied to the entire terrain, at the very tops of the mountain, you would get trees, you would get grass, you would get things that you just don't want up there. So what this fall off does, this is something that's new now to 3.0. I give you the ability to clip that by height. So that way it gives you a little less work to do to remove all the trees or remove it from anywhere you don't want it to actually pop up to. For the slope information, pretty much everything is the same for changing your slope, which pretty much changes how much each layer is going to cut off to be able to mask itself to show the terrain texture. There's a lot of things I can't remember if I have in the last one, but I know I did some work on the actual maps that you get from World Machine. So pretty much the flow map, the disposition map, and the where map are changed a little bit here. So where now we only use the flow map definitely for the actual terrain itself. I couldn't see any other better place to use the other maps. So for right now, all my trails and things like that are using the flow maps. And for what I need it for, it looks pretty good. And to actually help how snow accumulated on top of stuff, if you can see it over here, the where map from World Machine actually gave me if I use that for the snow, it gives a good overlay of the actual rocks, for me at least. And also there's controls in here for that. One thing that I do have, I can show this for right now at least. If we go in here, I added the ability to add an additional mask for the cliff, sand, and snow from World Machine. But it kind of defeats the purpose of the dynamic painting that you can do to be able to, the dynamic slope selects. So if you try to do anything that's opposite of trying to remove a cliff, since you have this force mask in there, it's not going to go away. Maybe you can paint over it, but for right now I have it as an option, but you don't have to use it. And technically I don't use it right now. So that's why I have it defaulted to disabled. One thing I have in here, if we can look at not the light mask, where is it? If we look at the shader complexity, okay. Now technically this terrain down here and these rocks up here uses the exact same shader, and what this does is it gives you the ability to cut off what you don't need in the terrain. So if you don't need any calculations from any of this stuff, you can just turn it off and get better performance out of your shader. I've tried to remove the majority of the stuff that I saw that was crazy expensive in the shader to be able to lessen the actual increase the overall performance, should I say, of the terrain itself. And this gives you the ability to just turn off those layers that you don't need, so that way you can get your performance back for it layering something that's not even really being impacted much on your terrain or something you just don't need. Also, I added the ability to completely turn off certain vegetation types. So if you don't need the forest, you don't need the grass, you don't need the rock, you can just turn it off there. Unfortunately, there's still no way to actually have the forest type as a parameter, so that way you can throw in your own type of grass, your own type of coverage for these certain areas in the actual material. But maybe they'll make something like that in the future. Okay, let's go into the actual material itself. Open, not close. I tried to clean this up of lines. Somehow it still got a little bit messy, but at least I tried to keep things somewhat together. The slope select is pretty much mainly everything that's complicated is in here, and even though it's still not complicated, we have our parameters over here to change our slope. And to change our slope for the grass, forest, rocks, cliff, all that good stuff. I've also added the ability to bring in the painted mask to be able to subtract your painted mask from the other ones that don't need that information. So hopefully this should reduce any bleeding effects that I saw before in the previous terrain, and also gives you cleaner mass that comes out of the actual output of this material function. Over here, this is where we bring in the masking information for the cliff, sand, and snow. And here we actually add the cliff information to the dynamically calculated cliff information. For the sand, we just completely overwrite our sand calculation with the imported sand calculation to show sand. So if you use that option, it will no longer dynamically calculate sand for that terrain that you put the instant material on. It'll just use the mask and purely the mask. As for the snow is the exact same way. So if you use the snow mask, it's going to completely override that. The main reason I didn't have a switch for it for the actual cliff, because there's a lot of places where you would probably want the cliff to come in to be a factor when you're manually manipulating the terrain, so that way it can be an additive. So all your big formations for the cliffs can stay static, and then anything you actually manually add to the terrain will just be added on top of this effect for the mask. I've moved our painted sections here, and hopefully an easy way for people to come in and add their own to the painted area. As well as up here, this is the limit section for our grass types. So if you want to expand your grass types, let me move this out the way. If you wanted to expand your grass cover types that's on the actual terrain and add a mapping to some other layer, or just have it to where you can raw paint vegetation information, you can just add it and expand this section right here to add your own grass types. And of course you will have to add your own painted layer name as well. One thing I probably should have done, if I ever had to update this will at least be in there. When I originally put the river, the naming convention in here, I did not know that they could not have spaces in the name. So if you actually create a painting type or a painting layer, whatever it's called, what is this? Target layer. If you ever add a target layer to this, it's going to say, hey, you're trying to make a target layer where we don't allow spaces. So you have to manually add in an underscore to the actual naming convention for when you actually add the weight to your painted section. So I should have done that. If I have to re-upload, I'll put that in there. Let's see. This is the dynamic beach information, self-explanatory. Since this is a little complicated, I tried to put this information here for how I calculate the snow, which is pretty much a compilation of using the snow mass that we did before, which is pretty much just gives you a solid slice across the terrain of where you want the snow to cut off, and we use that to limit the actual mask that you bring in for your snow mask. So you can actually bring a snow mask in that covers the entire terrain, but still limited by the snow height and the contrast and the fall off, however you want to do that, to be able to still limit that snow effect to a certain area on the terrain. As for this little piece right here, what I showed you about the edges of the grass before, since I have everything layered, I noticed before that if I actually put a material here, that material actually kind of embeds itself onto every layer above it. And if it has the normal information, if it has visual information, if it has even like the PBR information, it affects the layer above it in some form or fashion, kind of messing up the effect that you're trying to get for your actual terrain. So what I did here was actually add a kind of dark earth color to the base terrain for the base color with no effects. So that way when it starts to blend everything on top of each other, you don't get any weirdness. The only thing that happens is, and that's the main reason why I have the fall off information for the grass and all the other layers, is so that if you have a mask that's too sharp, you may see on the edges that little black gray area. Specifically with the grass that I was talking about before, I put that there intentionally just to have a blackened border for the grass, but everything else is actually blurred on the edges, so you don't see any of the underlining darkness. I need to disable autosave. And this also is where you can enable and disable the many different layers, so if you don't need it, you can get your performance back. We have the multiplication area for our overall macro color for the terrain. Also, you can modify the brightness color that we're multiplying the overall macro color with, and you can also desaturate it. And here's the information for the normal, the global normal. And this is the area where we bring in the information for the trail. So I'm trying to think if there's anything I'm missing. This right here, I have not found a way to actually dynamically be able to control what size terrain you're putting this texture on. So right now, if you bring in anything different than a 2017 terrain, you actually would probably have to duplicate this material and change the landscape coordinates to whatever you need. And actually, no, you can't make this into a parameter. I have not been able to figure out how to. I've even tried to make the coordinates so you can just type in the number of the terrain, and that just completely breaks everything. So either I'm doing something wrong or I'm stupid. I'm probably stupid, but there you have it for that. So if you make anything different from a 2017 terrain type, you're gonna have to just know that you're gonna have to change your master material, duplicate it, change it to whatever the terrain you're using, and then you can make an instance of it. And you can even change this original instance to instance the other one, so you can have a preset default terrain that you're actually working from, instead of having to go in and fill out every texture in that whole material instance list. Inside here, These are pretty much just the basic terrain select by slopes. I'm softening the actual selections and trying to subtract them from the other edges. So here we get the grass, slope, and we want to subtract that from the forest. So the forest can have its own unique mask. We also get the outer edges of the actual cliff area, which is the rock section, and then we're going to subtract that, and we're going to subtract from that the cliff selection area. So that way each of these have its own unique mask for its specific coverage. And here is where we bring in everything that we want to remove from every other layer, because we're manually painting this information on. So we want to remove the trail from everything. We want to remove the sand. We want to remove our snow, and we want to remove anywhere we paint a river. So that way we don't have any weird texture overlaying, fall off information, or anything like that makes the terrain look a little weird. Another thing is, technically you don't get a hard, unless you use a hard brush when you're painting, you will still get from these painted terrains in general, you will get a soft fall off. Unless you use a hard brush, then you'll get a hard fall off. So none of these are modified from how you use your paintbrush. So your paintbrush really controls how everything peels off of each other. I'm just going to one of these real quick. Compared to what I had before, instead of using a really complicated PBR calculations for the actual information, I removed that because that was killing some frames per second. And I tried to do the camera distant blends, but when you actually move the camera, or at least in the editor, when I moved the camera, that killed performance so bad. But I left it in here for anybody if they want to re-enable it. All they have to do is just drag this back into your color, and then you'll have all your settings to multiply your far distance scale material from your near distance. Well, not multiply, blend your far distance with your near distance material. Mind you, it did look really good. That's what, I have too many things open. Well, I was going to show my desktop, but that's what it originally looked like for my desktop that I cannot show. So let me just bring this back up. I showed the material already. I showed that. I'm not good at doing video tutorials or speaking in general, so please bear with me. So pretty much when you throw this down on the terrain, I have another video where I actually create this environment showing that pretty much this uses your dynamic calculation, your erosion that you bring in from another application and things like that. I think I'm getting near the end of time for this video. So in the next one, I'm going to actually show just a snippet of the things that I do to try to make terrains, just in case there's some people out there that wants to see that process or anything like that. Thank you.